Hi, everyone. I am so excited to do this workshop today because this is one of the native plant, types, I guess I should say. They're not families, types of plants that I'm most interested in. And they're such charismatic species that lots of people are very interested in them. And I think they're a great entryway into the native plant world for all sorts of people. People who might not even be interested in plants might still find carnivorous plants really cool. And there are a whole lot of them in Florida. So what are carnivorous plants, first off? Does any plant that catch and kill insects, is that considered a carnivorous plant? Because lots of plants actually do that. This photo right here is a picture of me holding rhododendron seriolatum, which is one of our native rhododendron species. I saw this just a few weeks ago. And you can see here on the bud, there are little hair-like filaments with sticky glands on the end of them. And there's a little gnat that is caught and dead on that bud. So all kinds of species of plants do catch and kill insects, like potatoes and petunias even do that. But we don't really consider them carnivorous because while they might be able to absorb some of the nutrients from those insects, they aren't relying on those nutrients and they are actively seeking out those insects. We consider it more of a defensive strategy to prevent herbivory. So what are carnivorous plants though? There are plants that are actively searching out the nutrients in insects and other animals because they are occurring in soils that are nutrient poor and lack the minerals and nutrients they need. Most plants get all the nutrients they need from soil, water, and through photosynthesis. But carnivorous plants, rather than putting their energy into competing with all the plants in the nutrient-rich soils, they've put their energy into finding other ways of resourcing nutrients in very nutrient-poor soils. They typically occur in soils that are acidic and wet, and those conditions lead to nutrient-poor soils. And we have quite a bit of soils like that in Florida, and especially in the Florida Panhandle. And in Florida, we have 3 different species represented by 5 different genera. 3 different families represented by 5 different genera that are all considered carnivorous. And so we have the Lentiburliaceae family, which includes the Bladderworts and the Butterworts. And we have the Sarraceniaceae family, which includes Sarracenia, the Pitcherplants. We have 7 species of those. We have Droseraceae family, which is pictured here with a little moth that it has caught. And the Droseras, Sundews, pictured here. We have 5 species of those. And then we have Dionaea, the Venus flytrap in Florida as well. It's not native, but it is naturalized here. And that's a monotypic genus. So there is only 1 species within that genus. And so as you saw, there are 3 different families of carnivorous plants in Florida. And there are carnivorous plants all over the world. And a lot of them might look really similar, but might not be closely related. And that's an example of convergent evolution, which means that environmental pressures have pushed these plants to evolve to look similar, but they might not be related. So there are many different mechanisms that carnivorous plants use to access nutrients. There are the pitfall traps like pitchers, and then we have snapping closed traps like the Venus flytrap. There are bladder traps that are vacuumed, kind of activated. And then there are sticky traps like the Sundews. So as I mentioned, Florida is a hotspot for carnivorous plant diversity. And I wanted to try to find a map that showed carnivorous plant diversity in the US, but I couldn't find one. I did find this map of threatened biodiversity hotspots, and we are one of them, of course. All of Florida is very biodiverse, but the Panhandle in particular is especially biodiverse and threatened. And most of these carnivorous plants occur in the Panhandle, especially the different 7 species of Sarracenia. Only 1 species of Sarracenia goes down south into the peninsula. The rest of them are pretty much in the Panhandle, and a lot of them are only further in the Western Panhandle. So here we go on the tour of carnivorous plants of Florida. I'm not going to go through all the different Utricularia species, the Bladderworts, because we have 15 of them, and all of them they all look fairly similar. Most of them are yellow, although we have a couple of species that are pink or purplish, like the one in the top left here. And they all use either underground or underwater traps. I will show you a little photo here. This is a extreme, portrayal of a very tiny trap, and a little tiny aquatic invertebrate might be swimming by here and is attracted by a sweet mucus that the trap secretes along the edges. And then when the trap is triggered by a little insect or invertebrate, it is pressurized and the trap door opens and it sucks in a bunch of water in very quickly, like within 1/100th of a second. And then it closes its little trap door, and then it digests it with digestive enzymes and acids within there. And then it can reopen its trap door and reset its trap afterwards. So moving on to the Sundews, Drosera species. Again, we have 5 species that are native to Florida. This is the most diverse genus of carnivorous plants worldwide. They occur on almost every continent, and there are around 200 species of Drosera worldwide. But we only have 5 species here in Florida, which is pretty good. And this is our smallest species. This is the dwarf sundrew, Drosera brevifolia. Drosera literally translates to dewy, and brevifolia translates to short foliage or leaves. And that's a very descriptive, it's a dewy short-leaved plant. And it's a very tiny plant. You can see a finger here in this photo on the right. They only get about 1/2 inch large at maturity. They have a fairly large bloom for such a tiny plant in proportion to itself. But they are short-lived annuals or short-lived perennials, and they rely mostly on reseeding and exposed sandy, wet soils. And just like all of the Droseras, they have these little filaments, hair-like filaments with sticky glands on the top, and these little filaments are called tentacles. And those tentacles produce this sticky dew at the top, and that dew glistens in the sun, and sundew, and insects that are flying around looking for nectar are attracted to this glistening dew, and they think it might be nectar. They come, and then as soon as they touch it, it's extremely gluey and sticky. And then once they are stuck, they start to pull and move to try to free themselves. And that movement triggers the tentacles to curl towards the insect to further ensnare it. And that movement also triggers the production and secretion of acids and enzymes to begin digesting that insect very quickly. Within hours and days, it liquefies the soft body parts of the insect right there on the leaf, and then can absorb those nutrients into the leaves. And here's another species. This is probably our most common species of sundew, and it goes down into South Florida, Central Florida. Drosera capillaris, pink sundew. Anywhere where there's wet, sandyish soils, you will probably find Drosera capillaris. It looks similar to the Drosera brevifolia, but it's a little bit wider. The basal rosette, they both are very low growing, stay low to the ground. But the Drosera capillaris, you see it has these slightly longer petioles, the little arms of the leaves. And this species does not have any of its sticky glands on the petioles, whereas the first species I showed you, the Drosera brevifolia, has glands all the way down its petioles, and the petioles are much shorter and fatter. And then we have spoonleaf sundew, Drosera intermedia. I love this one. It's just, you can see a wide color variation in just the 3 individuals I have photographed here. And this species tends to be really growing in or on water, right next to water. You can see there's water here and water here in the top right of the screen. And it uses the same mechanisms as the other species, but this species is a longer lived perennial. And it also has a really, that we are here in the Panhandle, we're at the southernmost extent of its range. It goes all the way up into Canada, which is always interesting to me when a plant can be that adaptable to, you know, such varying habitats and climates. But it's found a little niche in wet, you know, wet, nutrient poor soils, and it has really taken advantage of it. And then this is probably our second most common species after the pink sundew. This is Tracy sundew, Drosera tracyi. And it's our biggest species of Drosera. It can get about 12 inches to sometimes, I guess, maybe even 16 inches tall when it's flowering. And it has a tall, long, upright filaments that are covered in the sticky glands. And this photo I took over, I think this was in Santa Rosa County. It was like in the morning, and I had woken up early, was camping, and I got to see the sun, you know, catching all of these little dewdrops along this Tracy sundew. This species also has really showy flowers. And as the flowers open, as you can see in this photo, whoops, gotta go back. In this photo, as the flowers open, they open at the base first, and then that flower will fade in a day. And then the stem will curl up again, and each flower opens and kind of curls up. So it gets taller as it's flowering. And this is our rarest species of sundew. It's a very rare species of sundew overall because it's endemic to just 2 counties in Florida, and it doesn't occur anywhere else. It's a variety of Drosera filiformis called Drosera filiformis varfloridana. And it is different in that it's kind of small, and it has red or maroon leaves and glands and little filaments. And it only occurs, there are only a few populations of it, and it only occurs along these kind of little inland ponds with sandy margins in Bay and Washington County. Moving on to the butterworts. So butterworts are in the genus Pinguicula in the family Lintaburliaceae, which is the same family as the Utricularias, but they have a very different mechanism of carnivory, even though they're related to those Utricularias, the bladderworts. And butterwort, the term literally means, Pinguicula, the term literally means little greasy one. And they have these slick, slightly sticky leaves, and they tend to catch, they're not really sticky. They're not as gooey as the sundews do. They tend to catch smaller insects like gnats or springtails and little things that are crawling over the ground. And they, when you touch them, they feel kind of like slick and almost greasy, which is where it gets its common name butterwort and where the genus Pinguicula, little greasy one, comes from. And we have 6 species of these that are native to Florida. Most of them are in the Panhandle. We have, I think, 3 species that go down into the peninsula. This is Chapman's butterwort, Pinguicula planifolia. And it's a stunning species. It's one of my favorites of this species. It has really beautiful flowers, but I love the leaves. The leaves remind me of big tongues laid out on the ground. They even have a little like crease in the center, like a tongue. And they're lovely. They are variable in color. The one on the left is slightly purplish. The one on the right is kind of reddish. And then they also come in green leaves. And the flower color is very variable as well. And the flowers are very large for a Pinguicula. They get to be at least that big, like a quarter, like a large, well, about 1.5 inches across. So this species is also kind of unique in that it grows in areas that are seasonally inundated with water. I don't know if you can tell, but in the photo on the right here, those leaves are actually underwater when they're blooming. And often when they bloom in early March, late February, early March, and the areas that they occur in are often inundated with water when they're blooming. And the leaves are able to still ensnare aquatic invertebrates and digest them underwater even. This is one of our less common species of butterwort. It only occurs in the westernmost parts of the panhandle. And it is clearwater butterwort, Pinguicula primuliflora. And primuliflora means primrose-like flowers, which if you've ever grown primroses further up north, you can see the similarities in the flower and how it got that name. But this species occurs in like I mentioned, in the western panhandle of Florida, and it grows along clear water streams, hence its common name. And you can see here, this is a nice sandy bottom stream. It often grows in shade, whereas many of these other Pinguicula species grow in more sun. And you can also see it creates these dense patches because it's able to reproduce vegetatively. And so you get these kind of dense patches of it rather than a few Pinguiculas here and there like you do with the Pinguicula planifolia. This is a stunner of a species. It has nice big blooms and it has that incredible veination in the flower petals. This is blue butterwort, Pinguicula cerula, a very enigmatic species. They always look like they have these little fuzzy tongues like most of our Pinguiculas do, but this one, they often protrude. All of them, they kind of look like they're sticking their tongues out at you. But they're very variable in coloration of the flowers, as you can see here. And then you can see they have a little spur, like many of our butterwort species, where the nectar is retained back there. Incredible veination. They're really lovely in the sunlight, and the veins are lit from behind. And then yellow butterwort. Oh, I should mention that this Pinguicula cerula, blue butterwort, goes down into the peninsula. And so does this species, which is similar and closely related, the Pinguicula lutea, yellow butterwort. It has pretty much the same shape and size and coloration of leaves, and same shape of the bloom, but it's bright yellow, like a very beautiful yellow. Lutea means yellow, so yellow butterwort, Pinguicula lutea, and it has some beautiful veination on its spur there. And it's got their little fuzzy tongues sticking out. You can see it's a pretty big bloom for such a small plant. And then this is our most common species, and this is also the southernmost growing species. It grows all the way into the Keys. So this is small butterwort, Pinguicula pumila, and pumila means dwarf. So hence its common name, and it is indeed dwarf. It is a low growing species. You can see my finger right here. It's very tiny little basal rosettes and small flowers. The flowers are beautiful and very variable in coloration between white and purple. There's a little insect in there. Beautiful yellow throat. And then we have one species of butterwort that is endemic to the panhandle. It doesn't occur anywhere else in the world. This is Pinguicula ionantha, the panhandle butterwort. And it has very like a kind of pale limeish green yellow leaves. And it is often white with a kind of lavender center and lavender throat, or it is pure white sometimes, and then sometimes it's purple. It occurs in very low-lying areas, often around other carnivorous plant species like Sarracenia occurs in conjunction with this species. And yeah, very pretty. Oh, and just yesterday, my friend Sarah Johnson, who is doing research work on some of our native Pinguiculas, sent me this photo of Pinguicula ionantha seeds that are just germinating that she took, which I thought was really cool. And I asked her if I could use that photo. So look at this beautiful pile of Pinguicula. Isn't that gorgeous? So there are a few more pictures, little insect on there. And here's a very pale white individual. Okay, moving on to the star of the show, the Sarracenia. All of the carnivorous plants are pretty charismatic, but Sarracenia in particular especially. And I think it has to do with they're just physically larger plants and they have quite a presence because of that. And something to do with the mouth and the way they look. I feel like we personify them a lot, or at least I do. They look like chatty people, you know, and a whole field of Sarracenia look like all of these like chatty gossiping people talking to each other. But so Sarracenia have different modes of trapping insects. So the tall upright species like Sarracenia flava and Sarracenia leucophylla are pitfall traps where the insect is attracted to nectar around the edge of the hood here, and then it climbs in looking for more nectar and either falls in, it ends up in some digestive fluids down here at the base, and when it tries to crawl back up, it has these sharp hairs that are not fun for them to climb on. All of the species of Sarracenia have these sharp downturned hairs that prevent the insects from climbing back up. The other type is, we have one species, Sarracenia rosea, that actually relies on drowning its insects. So it has a very open hood. It doesn't try to cover its hood at all, and it catches rain water in its pitchers here. And it has some enzymes to digest the insects inside, but they're very weak. It relies mostly on bacteria and weak enzymes to digest its food. It's kind of a more passive species. And then we have the Sarracenia psittacina, the Parrot Pitcherplant, which has this small opening, which it is also laying prostrate, just like the Sarracenia rosea, but it doesn't catch and hold water. It has a hood that prevents water from getting into it. And then it has these little not holes, but they're little white windows, basically, that let light in to the pitcher. And so it tricks insects into thinking that the way out is down here and not up there where the sunlight is shaded from entering. And so the insects try to get out and they think they can get out here. They can't, they tire themselves, and then their movement triggers the release of these enzymes to digest and decompose the insects. And so all of the Sarracenia have similar blooms. They're very large, showy blooms, as you can see over here in the top left. They all have 5 petals that are downturned and hang from the blooms. And then most of them grow by these underground rhizomes. And the pitchers themselves are actually all modified leaves. So that's a leaf right there. And then this is the flower. So we have Parrot Pitcherplant, which I mentioned just a moment ago about how it catches its insects. And all of the pitcherplants have these kind of wing-like appendages that are called alas, A-L-A. And the ala has nectar, especially these low-lying prostrate-lying species, has nectar along the edge of it. And so if an ant or something is crawling along the ground, they have to crawl over this large ala, which the nectar leads them back to the entrance of the trap where there's more nectar, and then they go down and then and then it's over. So this is Parrot Pitcherplant, Sarracenia psittacina, and it's called parrot because the beak-like structure of its hood. It's in the family Sarraceniaceae, which all Sarracenia are in. And again, we have 7 species of Sarracenia in Florida. And the Parrot Pitcherplant has these beautiful dark red to almost maroon flowers in spring. Here's a beautiful, nice, very thick Parrot Pitcherplant I spotted. And this species is unique in that it is adapted to areas that are seasonally flooded, and it's low-lying, so it is adapted to being inundated with water. And earlier this spring, I was out in the Apalachicola National Forest, and we had some heavy rains, and I spotted these Parrot Pitcherplants that were completely underwater. And it was really interesting to get to see them, and they're actually able to catch invertebrates underwater as well and digest them underwater. So it can still eat while it is underwater. And notice that its blooms are tall enough to be above water so that it can still be visited by pollinators. And most of the pollinators for our pitcherplants are large bees, like carpenter bees in particular, but I thought this was a beautiful photo, kind of ghostly. And then here are a few more photos of Parrot Pitcherplant. Here is a lighter coloration in the blooms. And then, there's some, variation in the morphology and shape of the pitchers, depending on habitat, etc. And then you can see them here just resting right on the water. Okay. Oh, I just spilled some water. All right, so here's a few more photos. And then on the right here, you can see that's a Parrot Pitcherplant that was in quite a bit more shade. And so it has very little of the anthocyanins that color up the leaves, that dark reddish color. So if it were exposed to more sun, then it would probably color up, but it's light green because of that. And then here's our other species that is decumbent or prostrate, that lays on the ground rather than being upright. And this is Rose Pitcherplant, the Sarracenia rosea. This looks a lot like the more northern Sarracenia purpurea, but it has been found to be genetically different enough to warrant its own species. And there are a few other differences with it, such as the coloration of the blooms. The blooms are this pretty rose color. And another, the bottom right photo there, that's another area where these plants were in. They were a fire suppressed area, and trees had grown up around them and shaded them out. And so they have very little red coloration on them. And they also grew these very large pronounced alas, those wing-like appendages, because they're trying to catch as much sunlight as they can in the shade. So here are a few more individuals, some pretty venations over here on the left, some more green individuals in too much shade. And then here on the right, they're blooming in spring. They have very short blooms that hover just above their low-lying foliage, and they're very lovely in spring when a bunch of them are blooming. You can see this picture is these leaves are colored up so heavily because they overwintered and the cold weather turned them an even darker color. And then over here on the right, I took this photo when there was a prescribed burn coming their way. And I've seen this species, they bloom early in spring and around when the prescribed burns are happening or when they should be happening. And I've seen the species burnt to a crisp, and then they send up their blooms like a couple weeks after. They respond very quickly and bounce back very well after fire because they're fire-dependent species. And here we have the hooded pitcherplant, Sarracenia minor. This is our southernmost occurring species in Florida. It goes all the way south into Okeechobee County, and that's as far south as any Sarracenia goes. So that's notable. They have lovely yellowy, sulfur yellow blooms that come up in spring along with their fresh pitchers. And I love this photo here because again, they're so human-like in some way. And it looks like this guy is like bending back over laughing. And here are some more, morphological variations of Sarracenia minor. They all have this hood that covers the entrance, and that prevents water from coming in and also shades the entrance. And again, they would have nectar along the edge, along the lip of that entrance. And these windows, again, trick the insect into thinking that they can exit that way because light enters in through that white, the white patches on the leaf, and but they're not able to exit. And this species sometimes looks slightly devious to me, like it's plotting something, you know? And they also kind of look like a dude with like a devil lock. So I thought it's just fun to come up with stuff like that. So here we are with the most enigmatic species, I would say, in the Panhandle, the yellow pitcherplant. There's so many different varieties of it. It's also our biggest species, and it's just a stunner. Right? It's just kind of the king of the pitcherplant bogs. The variety of there are many different varieties of Sarracenia flava that have different shapes and colorations, and the variety that is most common in Florida is Flava var rugelii, and that's this yellow-green big pitcher, and it has this red maroonish blotch at the center. It's sometimes called Cutthroat Pitcherplant because of that. But the just straight true Sarracenia flava itself doesn't occur in Florida. It is up in the North Georgia and the Carolinas. They have yellow blooms that bloom in spring before their pitchers come up. And here we are, also called the Cutthroat Pitcherplant, Sarracenia flava var rugelii. These pitchers can get up to like 3.5, sometimes 4 feet tall. They can get rather large, surprisingly large. So they're very stunning, and it's kind of an otherworldly experience to walk among them. And here I am having fun with a pitcherplant, and then just showing how large they are. You know, this the hood on these species, and some individuals especially, have really large hoods. They're incredibly large plants. There I am again. And there's a nice picture of this area had been burned in the spring, and then these new fresh pitchers were just unfurling. They had already bloomed. So again, like I mentioned, there are many different variations of Sarracenia flava, and Florida has most of them. There's Maxima, Atropurpurea, Ornata, etc. They're not considered subspecies. They're just variations, and they aren't necessarily, like if you collected seed and grew that seed out, they wouldn't necessarily be consistent in that appearance. So here are a few examples of those varieties we see. Flava var ornata, Flava var Atropurpurea with the deep red burgundy on the inner hood. And then Flava var rubra has the kind of yellowy red lip and hood, but deep red pitchers, whereas the ornata has these stripes all along. And Whitetop Pitcherplant, Sarracenia leucophylla. This is, I think a lot of people consider this the showiest of all Sarracenias, and I certainly adore it. It's very variable in its coloration, but it tends to always be kind of greenish, with sometimes it has some reddish at the top, sometimes very little. And it always has lots of these white windows. And it has very beautiful scarlet red blooms in spring. And this is a pretty tall plant, about 2.5 feet, sometimes 3 feet tall, maybe 2.5. So this is actually a pitcherplant field in Alabama, just over the state line, and just stunning variation and coloration of these individuals. And then this area, this is just before the pitchers open up, they emerge closed at the top, and then they finally open. And it's really interesting to see because there's air inside them as the leaves emerge, and they unfurl, but they haven't opened. So you see these weird kind of shapes before they open.
Okay, I have a question.
Yeah,
How does the air get in there?
I don't know. I don't know. That's a good question. Okay, so here are a few more forms of leucophylla. These are kind of short and wide pitchers. This one, again, in Alabama and some areas of Florida, you see this almost these pink, that like the red has bled out into the white, and that's formed this pink coloration. And then there are populations with some really dark maroon edges and almost brownish coloration. Here's some blooming in spring before the pitchers come up. Oh, one more. Did I have any more photos? Yes. So one other thing about this species that's really interesting is, they wondered why this species is white. None of the other ones are white. And so it was hypothesized that maybe they're catching nocturnal insects like moths. And it actually has been proven that they do catch more nocturnal insects than other Sarracenia species. And during full moons, they catch even more because there are more insects out, and they're lit up. The white is lit up by the full moon. And they put up their biggest pitchers in fall. They put up spring pitchers, and then in fall, they put up even larger pitchers. And there's some hypothesis that the larger pitchers coincide with the harvest moon in fall to catch as many insects before the winter. And then here's an endemic pitcher plant to the Florida Panhandle. This is Gulf Pitcherplant, Sarracenia rubra, subspecies gulfensis. And this plant, it's a nice little, pitcher plant, but what's so incredible about this population, especially, there are a few populations that actually float on water in these little springs in the Western Panhandle. And there are just these kind of vegetative mats of floating Sarracenia and Drosera. There's Drosera intermedia, spoonleaf sundew growing with it, and then a little juncus repens, a little creeping rush that also floats on mats and grows along with it. And then you also see Utricularia, the Bladderwort species, growing around them. So that's really cool to see. Here are some more of the Gulf Pitcherplant, Sarracenia rubra, subspecies gulfensis. It has these nice dark venations. And then we have, this is our 7th species of pitcherplant, Wherry's pitcherplant. This is only in the furthest most, or westernmost portion of the Panhandle. It only occurs in, I think, maybe 2 counties over there. And it also occurs across the line into Alabama. It was thought to originally, I think, be endemic to Alabama, but they found it in both Alabama and Missouri, I believe. So this is Sarracenia alabamensis, subspecies wherryi. It looks a lot like the Sarracenia rubra gulfensis, but there are a few key characteristics, and I guess they did the genetics on it to be able to differentiate it. Oh, and then we have what makes these species, makes Sarracenia in general like even more charismatic and makes people just completely fall in love with them and become obsessed with Sarracenia, is that they naturally hybridize in the wild, and they form all of these really interesting hybrids. And it's so, they hybridize and then they'll back cross and cross again and become these crazy, you'll see all kinds of crazy individuals out there. So here, I'm going to show you a few of the naturally occurring hybrids that I see in the Panhandle. So this is Sarracenia formosa. A lot of these hybrids are named because they occur so regularly. And this is a hybrid of the Sarracenia minor, the hooded pitcherplants, and Sarracenia psittacina, the parrot pitcherplant. And so it has that very kind of beak like the parrot pitcherplant, but it's upright the way the hooded pitcherplant is. And the flowers are like a perfect mix between the two blooms, because the Parrot Pitcherplant has deep red blooms and the hooded pitcherplant has yellow, sulfur yellow blooms, and they're right in between. And then there's Sarracenia moorei, which is Sarracenia flava, the yellow pitcherplant, and Sarracenia leucophylla, the whitetop pitcherplant. They cross, and again, one has red blooms and one has yellow blooms. And so the hybrids have these in-between coloration of blooms. So they have this, the red throat that the Sarracenia flava var rugelii has, but they have the windows, the light windows that the Sarracenia leucophylla have. So it's a stunning hybrid. And so this is a straight species of Sarracenia leucophylla. And then that's the hybrid right there to compare it to. So you can see the windows are slightly more green often, but sometimes they're wider. They can become so interesting because you don't know if they've crossed and back crossed and then crossed again, but look at that. Isn't that just stunning? See, that's just the straight Sarracenia leucophylla right there. And then that's the hybrid of the two. And then notice the little spider right there hanging out. The spiders often will set up a little web above these, across the traps, so that they catch any insects that are trying to head down into the trap, and they'll actually preemptively, steal some food from the Sarracenia. Here's another hybrid. This is Sarracenia flava, the big yellow pitcherplant, crossed with the rose pitcherplant, Sarracenia rosea. So the rose pitcherplant is that decumbent species that fills up with water from the rain and drowns its insects. And this is kind of an in-between compared to the upright Sarracenia flava. So they often are just like these short, fat things that have, a little bit of that cutthroat, red throat. Here they are again, a few variations of them. They're just stunning. And so these hybrids are not always successful, and so they're not quite as common, but they usually are fertile and able to reproduce. And here's Sarracenia micheliana. This is Sarracenia rosea, the rose decumbent pitcherplant, and Sarracenia leucophylla, the whitetop pitcherplant. So they're like little mini whitetop pitcherplants that are short and fat. And you can see they only get, less than a foot tall, probably like 6 to 8 inches. And then pitcherplants have an obligate insect species called the pitcherplant moth. They are Exra species. They're in the genus Exra. There are many different species within that genus, but they can lay their eggs. The moths, the adult moths here, hang out inside the pitcherplants, and then they lay their eggs on Sarracenia species and inside the pitcherplant, and the caterpillar hatches and eats the inside of the pitcherplant. And so they spend their entire lives dependent on pitcherplants. And if pitcherplants aren't there, then these moths aren't there. But next time you happen to see a pitcherplant, you can poke your little head in and see if there are any in there. And then I noticed some damage on a pitcherplant pitcher from munching from this caterpillar. So I opened the pitcher up and there was that fat, chubby little caterpillar. And so our last species, this is not native to Florida. This is Venus flytrap, Dionaea muscipula. They're in the family Droseraceae, so it's in the same family as Drosera, the Sundews. And they are a monotypic genus, which means that there's only one species within the genus, and it's muscipula. And so muscipula actually translates to mousetrap, which, is pretty fitting. And Dionaea refers to the Greek goddess Venus, hence the common name Venus flytrap. And the functioning of this species is really interesting. It has these little, just a few, like 3 or 4 little hairs on this inside of this trap. And the hairs, when triggered, they have to be triggered, I think, twice within 20 seconds, or two of them have to be triggered within 20 seconds. And then if they are, the plant sends an electrical impulse that actually quickly lengthens the cells on the exterior of the trap, which quickly forces the trap closed. I don't know where the electricity comes from. The trap closes partially at first, and so that would release any smaller insects that wouldn't be worth the energy of digestion. So little small insects might get out, but if a larger insect is in there, it will keep moving and trigger the hairs again, and then that causes it to close all the way. And then it secretes, once it closes all the way, it secretes its digestive enzymes and acids, which digests the insect within a couple of days, well, depending on different variables, a few days. And then it can actually open its trap back up and reset. And sometimes, and so the skeletonized insect will be sitting in that trap, and that can actually be attractive to spiders, which are attracted to, insects as well. And the spiders are actually one of the insects that Venus flytraps often catch, interestingly.
Okay, I just have so many questions.
But I wanted to say, so it's not native, as I mentioned, it's not native to Florida, but it's been planted here in a few areas and it has naturalized. Here's a little teeny tiny one. You can see my finger here. And one interesting thing about carnivorous plants is that when they first germinate from seed, when they're small, they're just like tiny little miniature versions of themselves, because those are their leaves and they have to still eat. And so you'll see pitcher plants that are just teeny tiny, like this big, or little Venus flytraps that are just that big. But so here is the original native range of the Venus flytrap in the Carolinas. It's very restricted now, but they occur down here, and I consider them functionally native because they're still living in the same ecosystems that they naturally occur in, and so they have the same checks and balances that keep them in check, and they're still performing a function within their ecosystem. So I would consider them to be functionally native. They have the same associations with the environment. So they aren't growing out of control down here. Did you have a question about these in particular that you wanted to ask, Valerie?
So you said that the cells along the edge lengthen, and that's why it closes?
Yeah, I don't understand the very particulars of it, but I know that on the outside of the trap, the cells are stimulated by that electricity, which causes them to lengthen and forces it closed.
I think I need to watch a video of this happening.
Yeah.
Yeah, like a slow-mo video. Okay, and how does
Plants are always more complicated than you think they are.
And are the hairs sending the signal for the secretion to start?
Yes.
So it's like a length of time of stimulation?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And so here is what poaching looks like. So carnivorous plants face a lot of threats. Poaching is one of them. The biggest threat to them, so like I mentioned, Florida is a carnivorous plant biodiversity hotspot. So we have the most number of species in the US in the Florida Panhandle. And then as far as individuals, we have the most number of individuals, but we still only have about 3% remaining of what originally once was here. It's most of it has been lost to development and other agriculture, silviculture, all sorts of, human causes. And then another human cause that has killed a lot of our carnivorous plants is fire suppression. So Florida, as many of you guys know, is mostly a fire-adapted habitats. And these areas, even though they often remain wet, are no different. They do become seasonally dry and rely on regular fire intervals, and these species are fire adapted. So when they are suppressed from fire, woody species grow up and compete with them, shade them out, and they just, start to die. And then poaching is also, unfortunately, a serious issue with carnivorous plants because so many people love them so much and want to grow them at home. Personally, I don't grow them because I prefer to enjoy them. I'm lucky enough to live here and I get to see them. But if you are going to buy carnivorous plants, buy only from well-established and nurseries that have, good reputations. Don't buy from someone on Facebook or, through Craigslist, because those are probably poached plants. And the poaching has a serious effect on their genetic diversity. Even with, some people, the Venus flytrap is not technically native, but I would never dig one because I feel like it's functionally native. It's not invading anywhere. And I just feel like it's very bad to start digging. I think it's just, nobody should be digging in these areas. These are very sensitive habitats. And, people who have the correct permits can collect seed and grow these plants from seed, or they know how to take small root cuttings that can leave the parent plant and not damage the environment. So please just buy from reputable sellers. And then the other issue too is just habitat degradation due to too many people visiting these areas. And because poaching is such an issue and degradation of habitat is such an issue, I don't share locations of any of these areas with anybody because I've seen too much poaching and I don't want to have that on my conscience. And I also recommend that other people don't share the locations if you come upon them. And I take some people, just not even most of my friends, I don't even tell them where these are because I'm that protective of these plants. And I just have seen too many plants lost and it's so heartbreaking to me. So anyhow, that's the end of the talk. And if you guys have any questions, I'm happy to answer what I can.
Okay, so I think really good question. I mean, some not too many questions, but some really good ones. But I think we need to address a little bit of plant nutrition here because Marilyn asks, why do they need sunlight if they don't use photosynthesis to produce food?
Oh, yeah, well, they do use photosynthesis. They do photosynthesize, but all plants, not all plants, most plants use photosynthesis and nutrients and minerals, etc., from the soil and water. So most plants are relying on both of those things. And these plants are occurring in areas where the soil is not nutrient rich enough to provide the nutrients that they need. And so they've developed this strategy.
Right. So people, we have food, right? And we put the food in our mouths. Okay. But plants, they create food from the sun, but they also need nutrients that are not available. They cannot create nitrogen. They cannot create, potassium and everything else
Phosphorus,
that they're getting from phosphorus.
Yeah.
So they're drawing that from the soil, except when they can't.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's thus this carnivorous adaptation.
Yeah.
Let's see. Another question about their digestion. So you discussed enzymes, right, and acids that are used by various, I'm assuming these compounds are different based on the different species and geographic.
Yes, I believe so. And I do not know all the different names of the different types of enzymes and acids. That's above my level of interest. So I've never looked or I've never researched that to find that out.
And Andrew Mossberg asks if they're still dependent on any microorganism to to convert the trapped insects to a usable form.
Yeah, different species do use other, like I know that the Sarracenia rosea uses microorganisms as well to help it digest. So it depends on the species, but yes.
So,
and the other thing too is that those Sarracenia rosea, they're the ones that drown their prey, and that whole fluid that sits in those pitchers is like a microcosm of life in there. And there are mosquito species that are obligates to those pitcher plants that are not affected by the weak enzymes that are in there. And they lay their eggs in there, and the larvae live inside those pitcher plants.
So obviously people have studied the insects and other organisms. I mean,
yeah.
Are there studies where all of the gut flora of pitcher plants have been documented?
I'm not sure. I know that the research on Sarracenia rosea was done at FSU by a professor, so you could look into. I went to a talk of his and learned a lot. I can't remember his name right now, but you could definitely find out if you Google hard enough.
All right, so back when we were on Butterworts, Teresa Blanchard asks, the flowers don't eat anything, do they? Just the leaves? No.
Yeah, they do not eat their pollinators. So the flowers, as you noticed, are above the leaves and much further away. And no, it's different insects that are attracted to different things, and they still provide nectar in their flowers and pollen for a reward for pollination.
Right. Yeah. Don't eat your pollinators.
Yeah.
Yeah. And another good question from Teresa: what are pitcher plants dependent on fire for exactly?
They're dependent on it for, well, I'm sure, fire probably releases some nutrients into the soil, which is, much needed for them. But it's just like many of our native species, they're dependent on fire to prevent competition of woody, shrubby plants and trees. So in these areas, often there's Cliftonia or tie, growing along the edges of these wetlands. And if fire doesn't return regularly, they will encroach, and then they shade out all of these plants. They outcompete them. They compete for nutrients and sun, and then these plants peter away.
Right. So it's not really that the plants themselves are dependent on being literally burned, right?
Oh, correct. Yeah, correct. They're not. Yeah. They're adapted to it. They don't necessarily want to be burned. They can handle being burned.
And yes, there is some talk about, wiregrass, seasonality of flowering, and, there is certain effects on when the fire happens. But for the most part, when we say fire dependent, it's sort of the wrong, the plant is not dependent on fire. The very specific high quality level of the ecosystem is dependent on fire.
Correct.
So.
Yeah, it's dependent on fire to create the environment it needs.
And very sensitive to not getting it.
Yeah.
Well, that is all the questions. Those are all the questions in the chat. Okay. Right at 1.
Yay! I can't believe that. Well, I'm sure there's something I forgot to mention, but the big thing I wanted to put across is if you're going to buy these plants, please be very ethical about your decisions about where you purchase them. Do not ever dig these plants from the wild. That's very highly unethical. That Florida is a carnivorous plant hotspot. Like worldwide, people come from all over the world to see these plants here. And so if you live in Florida, you should make a trip up to the Panhandle. The Apalachicola National Forest, you can drive down Highway 65 and see pretty much any rare plant in the forest is along the highway there if you look hard enough, and you can see lots of these species. So just appreciate them. Be careful where you step when you walk in these areas, because stick to whatever paths you see, because it's incredibly dense as far as number of individuals per square inch. And the soil, because it's mucky and wet, you can really tear it up really quickly and easily, and it doesn't bounce back quickly. So keep that in mind.
Right.
And don't share the locations publicly, please.
Right. So Andrew just popped in. One last question.
Yeah.
Should I hide the locations if I'm putting them in iNaturalist?
Oh, yes. Let me mention, with all plants I upload to iNaturalist, I obscure everything. And that's because you can see common stuff right next to really rare things. And if you post them at the same, people can see what time you posted it. And if you posted it to a minute after the common plant that you saw, then they can figure out the location. And unfortunately, because native plants are becoming more and more popular and demand for them is increasing and the supply is not quite there yet from growers who are trying to figure out how to grow and propagate these plants, there is a lot of poaching. And so with all of these habitats being further fragmented and already being so imperiled, protecting them is very important. And so I obscure all my iNaturalist observations for that reason. So please do that.
Yeah, and so I don't obscure all my observations, but if I'm going to a certain place on a certain day, I go back and I obscure that entire day.
Like if I'm at, a lake in town where there's like a sidewalk around and people go all over the place there, then I wouldn't obscure any observations there, but and there's nothing rare there, but if I'm out somewhere in a natural habitat that is sensitive, especially any carnivorous plants, orchids, milkweeds, those are all plants that are poached right now because there's just such high demand for them.
Yep. Safe, iNaturalist, use iNaturalist safely.
Yes.
Yeah. But use it.
Yeah.
All right. I hope everyone has an excellent weekend. Thank you, Lilly. This was, fantastic.
Yay. I love them so much. And I just, growing up in Tallahassee, I never knew that we had all of this all around us. And so I want everybody to know so that we continue to prioritize protection and conservation of these areas and these species, because they're very unique and irreplaceable.
That's right. So thank you again. And I'll
all right.
see everybody next week where you can take some solid action on the Aquaha. Okay. Bye, everyone.